Hi everyone, my name is Dan Stern. I'm speaking to you from the offices of Jewish Federations Canada, UIA. Today's Thursday, May 3rd, and we have the pleasure of having Professor Amos Guiora here in Canada. He is touring some of our small communities, and he was kind enough to take a little bit of time out to tell us a little bit about some of the things that he's working on. Amos is a professor of law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, University of Utah, a Fulbright scholar. He does work in Europe and is a 15-year veteran of the IDF. He is a world-renowned leader in counterterrorism, both in the legalities and moral issues related to such endeavors. Amos, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've had the pleasure of taking you to a couple communities, specifically Oshawa and this evening Kitchener-Waterloo, and there have been very spirited discussions that we've seen at these audiences. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now in terms of counterterrorism and where things have come. It's been quite a few years since 9/11 brought this into the public eye in a much different fashion. Where do you see the current issues occurring in counterterrorism, or what are your comments in terms of what's happening at the present day?
So in terms of book projects that I've worked on and working on looking into the future, I just finished a book on targeted killing, what the Americans call the drone policy, what in Israel is called targeted killing, the policy of deciding under what circumstances can you kill a terrorist rather than detain him. So I finished that book last week, and it's coming out later this year. And I'm presently working on a new book on extremism, secular and religious extremism, in 7 different countries. And perhaps it's relevant to the date that you mentioned today, being May 3rd, because in the next day or so, the brother of the assassin of Prime Minister Rabin is going to be released in Israel. His 16.5-year jail sentence is up. And there's no doubt that Yigal Amir's decision to kill the Prime Minister and his brother's facilitation assistants is without a doubt the dark moment in Israeli history. It darkened in so many different ways, and his brother Chagai sat in jail for 16.5 years. That was the sentence given to him by the court. But it really raises really profound questions about extremism in Israel, about religious extremism. So the book I'm working on indeed addresses the Rabin's assassination and the role of incitement. I really do think in terms of going forward, that's a powerful question to discuss. With respect to counterterrorism, there was much hay made of the fact that a year ago, 2 days ago, bin Laden was killed. But I don't think in any way that's the end of Al-Qaeda, and in no way is that the end of terrorism. Maybe it's forced terrorist organizations to rethink in terms of how they want to go forward, but there's no doubt that terrorism is here to stay. It is, if you will, the scourge of our century, and clearly of our generation, and unfortunately of our children's generation. And even though bin Laden is dead, under no circumstances should we say, oh, we're done with terrorism. It's going to, as I say, stay with us forever and a day. And so one of the great questions facing the nation state, whatever nation state it is how to, on the one hand, protect the innocent population, and on the other hand, to proactively and aggressively minimize the threat posed by terrorists. And in many ways, if you ask me where's terrorism going, it's that balancing question that I would suggest is the fundamental question of our age.
When you talk about where it might be an unfair question, but where is terrorism going? Where is counterterrorism going? Obviously, being Israeli and a resident of Jerusalem, although spending a lot of time in the U.S., you are in a unique position to see how both governments are handling their strategies towards that. Not to mention your work in a lot of European countries. Do you have any comments about either Israel, the U.S., or any other countries in terms of new models or new strategies of how they're dealing that? I don't want to make it as simple as.
No, I think that's a fair question. I think that in Israel, for obvious reasons, we're more experienced and more schooled, both in terrorism and also in the limits of counterterrorism. The American model American experience with terrorism is largely new. And I think to that extent, various counterterrorism measures that were implemented by the Bush administration and subsequently by the Obama administration have probably been more reflective of a panic response rather than a true policy approach. To that extent, not here in Canada, but in the United States, this is pretty new. In terms of where it's all going, one would hope that over the course of the years to come, that whoever is president of the United States will be able to implement and articulate and implement policies that are firmly rooted in the law. I think the attempt by the Obama administration this past week to articulate the drone policy and to explain it more in the context of legalese and morality, I think is an important step forward. Did I find it overwhelmingly convincing? No. Is it an important step forward? Yes. With respect to European countries, again, as you correctly mentioned, I spent a lot of time in Europe. The Europeans are in an absolute state of flux in terms of articulating to themselves what is terrorism and what is counterterrorism, and from who does the threat come and how to respond to the threat. And if I were to, view this on a continuum, I would say that the Israelis are unfortunately well ahead of the curve. The Americans are a couple of steps behind, and the Europeans are a couple of steps behind that.
Israel, of course, as you mentioned, having the sad experience of many more years of dealing with these issues. Many people are currently focused on the situation with Iran and what is happening there. Here you have a nation state that supports terrorist activities, primarily focused against the West and Israelis in particular, and also with its own military, many times requiring, as you had phrased in some of the talks, the soft responses and the hard responses. With everyone's focus on Iran and what's happening, how do you see that situation, and what would be your comments at this time?
Well, the obvious elephant in the room, be it in Washington or Ottawa or in Europe and obviously in Israel, is Iran going to develop the bomb, and what's the significance of that? And I think the truth of the matter is nobody really knows where this is heading. And I would suggest that the so-called talking heads be extremely careful with their predictions and expectations, because I want to emphasize I don't think anybody really knows how this is all going to play out. And even if you look at the Israeli public, the public is divided as to whether or not we in Israel can live with a nuclear Iran. I mean, it's not 100% this, it's not 100% that. It seems to be split. And the follow-up question is, let's say that Iran is about to go nuclear. Should Israel attack Iran? And there too, the public is split. There's no doubt that the recent decision by the U.S. taking the lead, but also with the Europeans to impose some pretty strict and stiff sanctions on Iran, or in particular not enabling Iran to be part of the SWIFT banking system, that has absolutely imposed some hardships on Iran in terms of their ability to trade currency. I think it's not by chance that the Iranians have signaled, again, to what extent and how genuine is the signal, open question, their willingness at least to discuss with the West the possibility of coming down from that tree of the nuclear Iran and maybe having a second look at the issue. There's no doubt that the West was pushed into these conversations with Iran because of Israeli pressure. There's no doubt about that. Now, if you play this out to its logical end, if Israel pressured Obama and the Europeans to engage the Iranians in these sanctions, and the process has begun, then that's, I think, clearly a reflection of Netanyahu's pressuring. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We now have to, there's a delta, there's an X factor into it coming into the equation, and that is that on the 4th of September there are going to be elections in Israel, and on the first Tuesday of November there are going to be elections in the United States. And if we're here May 3rd, so if you go May 3rd, September 4th, let's say it's November 4th, plus minus whatever that first Tuesday is of November, there's a pretty straight continuum here, and it's not by chance, I think, that on Tuesday, the Israeli Prime Minister's National Security Advisor went to Europe to meet with European leaders in order to truly gauge whether or not the Iranians are serious about backing off. So if you take this all together, in many ways, there's going to be, quote unquote, a recess in terms of what can be done until at least after the American elections. So we're in January, if you're thinking ahead.
January 2013.
Exactly, and I would say between May 12 and January 2013, what you're going to see more than anything is conversations with the Iranians about the sanctions. You'll see a fair amount of political bluster. You'll see a fair amount of leaked information. But I think from the perspective of any kind of a military operation, I don't think anything is going to happen.
Very interesting. I want to thank you very much for spending a few minutes to talk to the vast majority of our supporters and people in Canada who are not able to have the pleasure of attending and participating in one of your presentations. You can read more about our efforts at www.jewishcanada.org. amos.org. Also, feel free to send us your email address. We'll be happy to add you to our list, and we'll let you know when Amos has some pieces published and when his most recent books are available, and where the upcoming ones will be available as well. Thank you very much.